Welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chainy podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Cheney, and I'm really, really honored to have a special guest on today, Allan Rutter. He's going to talk a little bit about the government and academic side of logistics and transportation. It's what he's been doing his whole life, and I'm really happy to be able to talk with him today, get him to share some of his nuggets of wisdom and experience with us, and maybe have a little bit of fun in the process. Who knows? So, Allan, can you do a little bit better job of introducing yourself than I just did?
Well, the short version is I'm Allan Rutter. I'm a freight analysis program manager at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. TTI has been in business for about 74 years now, is simultaneously an independent state agency and part of the Texas A&M University system. My boss reports to the Chancellor for Engineering, who reports to the Chancellor for the A&M system. We've got about 450 full-time researchers who do everything from pavements and structures to mobility, and I am part of our group that does freight research. That's maritime, trucks, rail, pretty much how stuff moves. We help public and private sponsors help understand and explain why that matters and what it is. And that's the part of a very long career in transportation, which we can get to talking about. And I can always send people to my LinkedIn profile, which lists all that many career stops in more detail.
You know, speaking of LinkedIn, I always appreciate your, hey, LinkedIn peeps messages with your little news bites and updates on the industry. Again, I just appreciate kind of just sharing what's going on, you know, in different levels of the industry. I'm curious about how, you know, can you talk a little bit about that career path? You know, I think you may have studied at a different kind of school that's got a very different kind of color than what you're used to wearing these days, probably. But can you kind of walk us through what your career path has been?
Yeah, so you are right. I did go to that other state institution or state-supported public university fund-supported institution in Austin. And so I am a professionally trained bureaucrat from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And sort of backed into transportation. It wasn't really anything that I had intended to do. My thesis for graduate school was on public arts administration and the creation of the National Endowment, which LBJ had signed into law, and how it was influenced by Depression-era arts programs. Yawn. And so when I interviewed for the Federal Railroad Administration job, Secretary Norm Mineta, looked at my CV and said, okay, so how does a guy who does that thesis end up in transportation? And so the short answer is part of it was some research projects at the LBJ School on transportation, highway finance, and some other things that we were doing for the Texas Department of Transportation. And the other part was when you are at the LBJ School, you usually do an internship. Most of that's on at the Capitol. And my college Sunday school teacher, who was a nursing home lobbyist, his nephew, David Kane, who went on to be a state senator from Dallas, was the new chairman of the House Transportation Committee. So Uncle Pat got me a job with David. And then 2 years later, I joined the House Transportation Committee staff as an assistant clerk and have remained in transportation ever since, working for 4 different governors of both parties, a stint at the ill-fated High-Speed Rail Authority back in 1990 to 95, whose primary accomplishment was being one of the few state agencies that the legislature has actually killed. They took it out back and shot it. I mean, they've got formally sunset. And then one of those governors that I worked for was Governor George W. Bush, who becomes president. And I had the honor of being able to join him and the administration in Washington, D.C., where I served as the Federal Railroad Administrator, the head of a then 800-person agency primarily focused on rail safety. Today, it's got a little over 1,000 people and has $60 billion of passenger rail money to hand out. And after 3 years in D.C., I came back to Texas to be the deputy and eventually the executive director of the North Texas Tollway Authority, which was about the only job I've ever had where my daughters could explain to their friends what I did. Yeah, my dad's the tollway guy. Did that for a couple of years and then consulted for a private sector transportation research firm, Cambridge Systematics, and then 10 years ago joined TTI as their freight guy. or as a freight coordinator. We have plenty of freight guys.
Yeah. Freight coordinator is exactly the kind of title that someone straight out of school would have if they're going into a logistics company. So it's kind of funny that a freight coordinator can be a 20-year-old, or it could be you with all of your immense amount of experience. Um,
Yes, in the Medicaid Part A uh, eligible category.
so out of all of that, there's a wealth of knowledge, a lot of different roads that we could go down with this conversation. But I think that the focus here, and what I think I'd like to share with the audience, is the government, sort of how policies and laws and regulations affect the transportation sector, for commercial purpose transportation, I guess, and just residential normal Joes driving down the road, down the tollways and highways. Kind of to just open up the question, though, how do you see the role between government and private organizations providing that logistics infrastructure for trucks and rails and people to move on? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a relatively new phenomenon. Some of it's come from Congress requiring and requesting state departments of transportation to do more freight planning. And with each surface transportation bill, they become a little more explicit about the kinds of things they want included in those plans. Texas has been fortunate in that they've had a fairly robust freight transportation planning function, and that really got started almost 10 or 15 years ago with the advent of the Panama Canal expansion. TxDOT created a commission of public and private folks to talk about what would happen or what will happen when that happens. That then morphed into a freight advisory committee, which has been in existence ever since. And Congress has asked those freight advisory committees to oversee or at least interact with the state as they do their freight plans. And those freight plans are multimodal, even considering the stuff that the DOT does not own, which of course includes most ports and all the freight railroads and airports, which deal with cargo. Their job is to consider how all that stuff connects and gets together. I'd say historically, transportation departments and highway guys have always been concerned about trucks, but they've seen trucks as mainly wheels, equivalent single axle loads that are that 80,000 pounds as it affects their pavement. And that those effects on pavement are that much more than normal cars. And so eventually, I think these departments of transportation both started asking, why are those trucks there? And where are they going? And what are they doing? So I think what's happened as a result of all this thinking about why trucks are there, it's encouraged and grown the departments of transportation ability to understand why what they build, roads, matters, and how they build them matters to how freight gets moved in the state.
Which has an economic impact on the ability for that state to be economically competitive against others, and imports and exports, and bring jobs to the state and all that sort of good stuff. It kind of sounds like what you just said what reflects the fact that logistics has as a academic concept, or as a science, or as a profession, has matured and kind of developed over the years to something that's really a science. And it sounds like those state agencies have kind of gone along with that and appreciated the nuances and the whys and the hows of it a bit more than they did earlier in the days when they just thought they were just wheels rolling down the street.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, logistics is as much operations research and kind of how to match capacity and assets and expectations for all the people that are doing that. I think departments of transportation now understand and have, frankly, a much better data to understand how freight uses their system, so that they can identify, within the 78,000 miles of highway that Texas has, that the State Department of Transportation owns, which of those routes matter most to freight. And so they can track which of those routes has more trucks, which of those routes fits within different supply chains, and how those supply chains matter to the state's economy. I think if you look at the most recent Texas Freight Mobility Plan, Texas Moves 2050, it actually has in it supply chain discussions, both electronics and agriculture and manufacturing, and how each of those supply chains uses the multimodal transportation network and what that looks like. So I think the departments of transportation are getting a lot more sophisticated about how to think about their networks and what that means to the economy.
I had the pleasure the other day of visiting the Bush Library at SMU for the first time, and it was a treat. It was really awesome to kind of step back in time and see what it was like, when he was a governor, and see some of his accomplishments as president. I'm curious, Alan, because you were kind of in that circle and you were looking a little bit after transportation at that time. What are some of the things that happened, that the public would have seen that you were maybe kind of working on in the background, to help, that administration from a transportation perspective?
Yeah, I'd say so. I got appointed, or I got nominated in April of 2001 and was confirmed in July, about late July 2001. 2 months later, I'm in Chicago for a commuter rail Great Crossing safety event on September 11th. And so September 11th happens. Secretary Mineta is in the Situation Room, who makes the decision. We're going to take all the planes, every commercial aviation. We're going to take that down for the first time ever. And so I'd say my 3 years at FRA were colored by a lot of concerns and a lot of questions about security, particularly from the rail side, and how to balance security concerns and the needs that the railroads provide for the economy. I'd say there's a lot of hazardous materials that people are really uncomfortable with. And so we had to help people understand that, yes, chlorine is a particularly hazardous material, but it's kind of necessary for drinking water. So we need to make sure that that stuff moves across the country, but manage the sort of security aspects of it. So I'd say behind the scenes, there's just an awful lot of concern about what railroads, what the risks are, and how people manage those risks. That was probably the most unexpected part of my tenure, and working with security folks within the White House, helping them understand why the movement of goods on freight railroads was really necessary and wasn't the kind of thing that you could stop simply because it was a security risk.
And that whole concept has been getting a lot of airtime in the news these days with, the speed and velocity of news travels so much faster today that every hiccup everywhere is kind of known and ripples across the whole ecosystem pretty quickly. I'm curious with what you're doing today and what you've kind of done over your career. What advice would you give, someone in school that's looking to try to aim for where you're at? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think one of the things that's different today than it was when I was in college, which, let's be honest, was a long time ago. I guess I graduated with my graduate degree in 1985, so that's a long time. So I think one of the things that's different about today's environment is that there's so many more universities with supply chain programs dedicated, specific. This is we're going to help you study supply chains. And then there are, folks who help look over that, the Gartner sort of rankings and descriptions of how that stuff works. So I'd say, if you want to go into the helping people move things, brokerage, 3PLs, all that kind of thing, there are options and avenues that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, or in my case, 40 years ago. That said, I think there's something to be said for a more generalist approach, which when I was at the LBJ school, that was what our sort of mantra was. We're not really going to hone in on specific parts of the government. We're going to give you tools to help understand problems and apply those problems pretty much wherever you find them, whatever level of government you find them in. So I'd say, on the one hand, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of how stuff is moved, there's all kinds of options for you to do that and apply those wares in actual companies that do that kind of stuff like you do, Nathan. I'd say the final thing to point to is not so much the background as how you do it. Most everything that's opened up for me has been a result of relationships and people that I've known. So as you go about your business, the more you remain open to and aware of your relationships on a professional and personal level. Generally speaking, for me, my career path has been driven by those relationships.
Here, here. I 100% agree. And it's, I have a lot of students that ask me for advice and suggestions, probably like yourself, and around that career starting and how do I get that job? And I always point to networking and its relationships and get out there, in industry groups and volunteer and put your time and effort into it and it'll reap rewards. What kind of guideposts do you have to kind of keep you, focused on what's important in life and with your family and your career? Any thoughts there?
Well, I'd say, some of that requires a acknowledgement that your professional life is not your life. It's part of it. It's a means by which you do the rest of your life. I think it's part of the way I see myself. Part of who I am is who I am at work. Part of who I am is who I am to my family. I'm a husband and a father and a grandfather, or poppy, to my two grandsons. Some of that is, or a lot of that is reflected and informed by my faith. So all of that together, one of that is helps you understand that your life is a little more rounded than who you are professionally. Uh, so a lot of how I try to do my job is kind of how I try to do my life, which is, golden rule: treat people the way they want to be treated, have as much humility as is possible. I'd say if there's something that I've learned or tried to apply, it goes back to, I guess, my high-speed rail days, the first chance I had to go from a staff person to an actual leader of something. And that is, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Uh, if you have the capacity or legal authority to do a whole bunch of things, uh, uh, you have to be concerned about, or at least aware of, what are the implications of you making some of those choices and decisions.
One of the questions I do ask most of my guests is, can you give an example of a time that you made a mistake? If you've got one of those record hits of fails in your career, one, I think it helps other people just to understand that my guests are human and make mistakes, but also for them to be able to reflect a little bit like, okay, I've made a mistake yesterday. Here's someone who's done something also, but they made it through, they learned from it, and things are going to be all right.
The most direct one is the circumstances under which I went from being executive director of the North Texas Tollway Authority to not being the executive director of the North Texas Tollway Authority. I think the board got to a point where they believed that where they wanted to take the agency would be best accomplished with me not being in that role. And so I had to come to grips with, okay, what was that about? And what does that say about me? Ultimately, it came to the conclusion that, eventually what ended up happening was there were a number of executive directors that sort of revolved through the doors. So that part of it was, well, it's not just you. They're going through some of that. Uh, some of it recognized that some of the things that led to that separation were not solely of my own making. And some of the things that I did do that made it possible for those decisions to be made, I'm not sure I would have done anything different anyway. So ultimately, I think that experience for me was a nice recognition that even when things happen to you that you had something to do with, that does not mean that your life is over. And in that case, it gave me the opportunity to shift to a pretty different career path, and everything worked out for the best.
I like to take that question and turn it around also and ask, what is the high point of your career? What's your biggest accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Well, I'd say the thing that I get the most pleasure out of is the opportunity to go serve the president, President George W. Bush. That doesn't happen all that often. That experience was such a big shift to go from being a staff person to being somebody who led an agency, and to have the prominence that comes from that, and the honor of being part of the Department of Transportation to serve Secretary Mineta, who was such a remarkable person and a leader. The DOT building is now named after Secretary Mineta and Secretary William Coleman. So to be there at that time, it was just such an honor and a pleasure. And so much of what I've done since, being the railroad guy, that really starts from, well, you were the FRA guy, so you must know something about railroads. So I'd say that was probably the highlight of my career, and that includes, being able to go to Japan and ride on high-speed trains as the FRA guy. It means being in the White House, attending meetings, talking about railroad stuff. Uh, that's as a professionally trained bureaucrat. That's the kind of thing that you had hoped would happen, uh, and it was remarkable that it happened when I was so young.
Congratulations on that. I mean, that does seem like I think that would be the highlight of anyone's career for sure. So you've talked, a lot about rail. You've talked about infrastructure and the tollways. One of my previous jobs was with autonomous vehicles, and that's kind of a pretty hot topic these days. Could you talk a little bit about, whether here in Texas or beyond, just kind of the mood in the room regarding autonomous, 18-wheelers or box trucks or passenger vehicles? Can you share some insights there?
2017, the Texas legislature adopted some legislation that provided a fairly open-ended, if you want to experiment with autonomous vehicles, here's the way we're going to do it. You're not going to have to ask us permission. You're going to be responsible if anything goes wrong. The operator of the vehicle or the owner is considered the operator if you get pulled over by the DPS. And you have to have some insurance to make sure that if something goes wrong, you're responsible for it. But beyond that, Texas is open for business. And as a result, there's an awful lot of autonomous trucking companies that are active in Texas. And that goes from the sort of middle mile box truck kinds of things that Gaddick is doing to smaller vehicle deliveries for groceries by Neuro and then some even smaller vehicles to the 18-wheelers, the Aurora, Kodiak, Waymo, Wabi, Torque. I mean, there's a whole bunch of these guys, and they're all in Texas. Part of that is because the legislation offers a fairly wide range of opportunity, but also it happens because Texas is the second most populous state in the country. Yeah. Back to our secession dreams. I'd say that the other part of that is that Texas weather, even though it can be unpleasant at times, it makes it easier for those kinds of vehicles to operate within the state. So it's not surprising that those guys are busy on Texas roadways. TTI helps support the Texas Department of Transportation, who manages a connected and automated vehicle task force on behalf of Governor Abbott and has done for a number of years. And so there are subcommittees pretty much operating every year, thinking about what are the kinds of things that get raised as a result of autonomous vehicles operating within the state. We're helping a licensing and registration subcommittee that's headed by one of the leaders of the Department of Motor Vehicles. And that's everything from, if you're on the roads of Texas, what does that mean? What does that mean from a registration, fleet management? What happens when you get pulled over? How do those things operate well in the state? Now, the pretty remarkable technology. We actually got to ride on some of the equipment that Aurora is demonstrating on I-45, and just the background technology, the onboard computing power, and it's been really much harder than I think most of the developers have thought to actually equip a vehicle to operate in a roadway environment. And so I think to a certain extent, as much as we denigrate all of the drivers around us, we're really doing some pretty remarkable things with the brains that we were given.
I 100% agree. Whenever I was in that autonomous vehicle space, I had a great appreciation for the human brain's ability to process and think and plan ahead and know where's the big long distance goal and what's the next three things I need to do with my hands and my feet and my brain and my eyes in order to get just 10 more feet down the road safely, right? It was mind-blowing to think about how, the scientists that are creating autonomous vehicles have to take all this complex work that our brains do in a snap of a finger and be able to replicate all that, with technology. It's beyond impressive. Can you comment a little bit on other states that are not so friendly to the autonomous vehicle trucks, I guess more specifically? Kind of what's going through their minds and where do you see that? Do you see them kind of finally breaking down and accepting, or do you think there'll be some folks that hold out just forever?
Well, I think part of this is in the absence of a federal framework. The Congress has yet to say this is what we want to do about automated vehicles, in part driven by people who want to develop them, and then sort of the the trial lawyer industrial complex that is concerned about what happens when something goes wrong. So in the absence of any federal structure, I think most states are kind of figuring this out for themselves. Other states like Florida or Arizona are similarly situated, sort of, hey, let's figure out how some of this works. I think California is a little more cautious about this, in part driven by labor concerns, seeing automated vehicle as displacing the jobs of drivers. I'm not really sure that's going to happen necessarily, in large part because the parts of motor carrier movements that most lend themselves to automated vehicles are the sort of over-the-road, multi-day travel that, frankly, is the kind of thing that most younger drivers are not all that interested in. And it's also reflected by the fact that most truck trips, if you look at them from an aggregate standpoint, are 150 miles or less. Most of that happens in regional movements. And that's the kind of thing that automation really isn't going to have as easy a time of. So I'd say that there are states that are more cautious about this, and all of them are sort of experimenting as they go along. It's also interesting that some of the associations of public agencies are kind of helping drive some of the concerns about this, or at least how to think about it. You can imagine there actually is a saying called the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AAMVA, and those are the DMVs and driver's license and registration agencies from across the country. They've got actually a third edition of the kinds of things to think about when you're thinking about automated vehicles. So there's an awful lot of learning that's happening behind the scenes among the various state agencies that are thinking about this.
I'm curious from like an academic perspective, do you kind of subscribe to the camp that autonomous vehicles and trucks can be safer, and that there's evidence that they are safer, that they will have less fatalities on highways and whatnot, or are you in a different camp, which is the humans are the better drivers? Can you pick a side here, or do you have a side, or do you need to remain neutral, or how would you take that?
Well, I think you have to be aware of the data. And the data is that nationally 40,000 people die on roadways every year, and that's a lot. Now, it happens discreetly, one or two at a time. When you have multiple fatality accidents, that's when the National Transportation Safety Board kind of inserts themselves into things. But the vast majority of those accidents or crashes and fatalities happen behind the scenes. I mean, you'll get something in the news, maybe somebody pays attention to it. But unless you're directly involved or affected, it kind of happens in the background. So I think that we have to acknowledge that our current system, which is driven by the accumulated effects of everybody making choices of how they drive and under what circumstances do they decide to drive, the consequences of those aggregate choices is less than optimal. So if there's a chance that automated vehicles in some way can lead to better safety outcomes, I think that that's one reason why you should think about them. The adoption of that technology, how that technology works its way into the fleet, both on the automobile and truck side, that's going to be gradual. So the data is going to sort of flow through under what circumstances do advanced driver assistance systems actually help safety. Right now, the jury's kind of still out on that.
There's this concept that speed and bigger roads and more capacity can allow commerce to move faster with less friction. But are there some downsides to that? Higher risk because pace of movement is faster, and the safety risks kind of grow a little bit more. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things our folks, my colleagues at TTI, noticed about what happened during the pandemic. 2020 and 2021, as work-related trips fell out for all kinds of obvious reasons, nobody was going to work anymore. So travel on the roadways, the vehicle miles traveled started to decrease. And one of the things that did was actual freeway speeds increased. And so one of the things we saw is 2020, 2021 highway fatalities did not decrease by the same percentage as vehicle miles traveled decreased. And one of the reasons was, as our guys started noticing from the data, is there were a lot more speed-related fatalities. As aggregate average speeds increased, it allowed for people to make choices to go faster. And one of the things that happens when you have faster travel is when something goes wrong, the consequences are that much worse. Vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, all of those kinds of things, the fatalities or the severity of crashes increases with speed. So I think one of the things we noticed was that as speeds increased, some of the fatalities, the rate of fatalities per vehicle miles traveled sort of went up.
I would not have thought that. I think that's really a really good insight that you've been able to share there. What about, there's something that's also a very kind of hot topic in the world of transportation and geography and politics and everything, and that's global warming and environmental changes that are kind of occurring here in Texas and around the world. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into the infrastructure for electrical grids and transportation in general?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the things that's, again, one of these sort of unintended consequences, or at least third order consequences of environmental policy, for all kinds of reasons, different levels of government have been concerned about emissions associated with electric power generation. I'd say electric Energy Information Administration within the Department of Energy has data about how our power gets generated. And historically, a lot of that has been by coal. Uh, and so what that's meant is as we find cleaner burning sources of coal, high sulfur coal in Wyoming and in the western United States, that led to heavy volumes of coal being carried on railroads, particularly the western railroads. As natural gas generation becomes more prolific and cheaper, such as out of the Permian Basin in Texas with fracking, it becomes lots less expensive to operate electric power generation through natural gas. And so now a majority of electric power generation in the country happens from natural gas, not coal. What that means is coal as a commodity by the railroads is down, decade over decade by 20, 30%. And that's a lot of revenue that's not in the freight railroad space, particularly for the Western guys. So I don't think anybody necessarily said coal generation, we don't want to necessarily change that because of its effects on railroads' bottom line. But the fact is that railroad commodity revenues have changed as a result of some environmental policy decisions over the past decade.
How does natural gas move from the Permian Basin, to where it needs to be consumed at those power plants across the U.S. or the world?
Most of that's pipeline. Now, that also requires for pipeline decisions, which are interstate in nature, for states to be comfortable about pipelines under their ground. And so we've seen certain pipeline construction, Keystone, there's a bunch of petroleum product movement that's attracted different industry or interest groups to say, we're not really comfortable about that. But particularly within Texas, most of that natural gas moves either to places where it's used as a feedstock for chemical production or plastics production, or for power for manufacturing along the Gulf Coast, or for liquefied natural gas exports. All of that moves from the Permian to the Gulf Coast by pipelines.
I recall back in studying supply chain management in school that, there was the main modes, air, boat, truck, and they always remember, they always was trying to drill into us, don't forget about pipeline, that's part of the transportation infrastructure also. As we kind of wrap up here, what's something that we haven't talked about today that you're really passionate about that you would like to make sure gets addressed and kind of gets out there for people to hear?
I think one of the things that some of me and my colleagues spend an awful lot of time thinking about is, as we've talked about safety, the elements of railroad safety that are the most measured, the most quantified, are not necessarily the kinds of crashes or incidents that happen on the railroads like East Palestine. The vast majority of railroad-related fatalities are grade crossings or pedestrians/trespassers that are on the right of way. And so one of the things that TTI does in cooperation with the private public sector sponsors we work with is how to think about improving outcomes at those intersections of railroads and infrastructure. Uh, there's a lot more opportunities for technology to help that, for less expensive technology than necessarily the grade crossing protection devices or a grade separation, which can be in the millions. There's a lot more actors and a lot more wayside technologies that can help people understand when a train is at a crossing and how to make better choices when you get there too. So I think one of the things that we're the most excited about is different technologies and their application toward helping drivers and pedestrians to make better choices in and around railroads, and help them do the kinds of things that will keep them safe. There's a national highway rail grade crossing transportation safety conference that's happening next month in August in San Diego. One of the things that TTI has had a history of is engaging and helping people think about grade crossing safety. So it's one of the things, both to answer your thing about what gets me jazzed, but also how can we make an impact? How can we make a difference? So I'm happy that one of the things TTI gets to do is help people think about that.
Excellent. I would like to be able to add that that event onto the supply chain events calendar, make sure it's on people's minds. Well, I appreciate that, and I think that out of this conversation, what I've kind of learned the most is that while so many of us, in the industry talk about warehouses and trucks and people and labor and making things and moving them around, that there is, a small group of people in the background that are making the policies and the regulations that we all have to work within to help keep us safe, and make sure that we're following the rules. And that you're kind of one of those people, and I'm really glad that someone like yourself is behind the scenes and helping make all that happen. And just appreciate what you've done over your career, to kind of provide the transportation infrastructure for railroads and trucks and roads and everything. And I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of that knowledge with us today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's a pleasure. And as we talked about the sort of relationship building and how things happen, my being in a position to get to meet you, to get to understand the kinds of things that you do through the Council of the Supply Chain Management Professionals and the Texas DFW Transportation Club. Those are the kinds of in meet space networking times where we learn and get to meet people. And that's one of the pleasures of my career today is the chances and the people I've gotten a chance to meet. And I really appreciate having a chance to get to meet you through that.
Yeah, for sure. Those relationships last year's. I was just trying to think about this morning, like when exactly did we meet? And I know it was at a CACMP or a Transportation Club event, and some years ago, and we've kind of stayed in each other's orbit ever since. So again, thanks for everything, Allan, and have a good rest of your week.
Appreciate it. You too.